Warm welcome to everyone, wherever you are, dialing in from today, Connecticut, Florida, New York City. My name is Elizabeth Nielsen. If I haven't met you yet, I warmly welcome you to this webinar program, Breaking Ground in Drug Development, Insights on MDMA and Tactogens. I'm going to introduce our guest today, Matthew Baggott, in just a moment. He's joining us and is really an amazing researcher in the field. I'm very excited for this conversation together. We had a warm-up call a couple of days ago, and we're really excited to share some great topics and updates with you. First, I just want to welcome everybody and thank you so much for attending, whether or not you're dialing in live online or you're going to be watching the video of this program later. These webinar series have been going on for a really long time. We've had a wide variety of guests, and we like to keep them conversational and nice place for you to also just learn about new interesting topics going on in the field of psychedelic therapy, drug development, and other things that might be going on in mental health care around psychedelics. But also to engage and ask some questions. So you've got the Q&A function available to you. And if you would like to ask a question, we will reserve some time towards the end of this program to get to as many of your questions as we can. If you think you have a question, you're not quite sure, go ahead and ask it anyway, is always my advice, because there might be somebody who's not attending live who is watching the video later and thinking the same question that you had in mind. So you're here live. Those of you who are here live, you get to represent those watching later and ask questions that you think might be helpful for anyone watching. I really appreciate you pitching in with that. It's important input. We also like to make sure that our webinars are interesting for you and for our audience, and so that you have a chance to learn something that is valuable to you. So it's helpful for us to hear your questions. Just by way of introduction from Fluence, again, Elizabeth Nielsen, I'm the co-founder of Fluence, and Fluence has been around for about 5 years. For those who might not be familiar with us, we're an education and training organization in the psychedelic therapy space. We are a continuing education provider for clinicians. We have a whole bunch of certificate programs and independent classes that you can head on over to our website and check out. And we also work with drug developers and other research organizations in the field. And one of the ways that we do that is we provide training for research study clinicians. So this is a program that a lot of people know us really well for, and some people don't know that we do because they're only coming from the continuing education programs that we also offer. And so on the drug development side, we have been involved in things like therapist treatment manual writing, adherence criteria creation, training program development, development of demonstration videos, didactic videos, other learning materials, role plays, all kinds of exercises, as well as feedback mechanisms and competency evaluations, as well as on-study mentoring and consultation for therapists who are working on clinical trials of psychedelics. And that's a lot of people. It's a lot of studies, a lot of study sites, a lot of people. And so that gives us exposure as an organization to what's going on in the most cutting edge and most interesting research, I think, in mental health currently in the world. And we have a whole range of relationships and contacts there and activities. And then when you do the continuing education courses, we're also pulling some of the same standards of training and education into those classes. And what's interesting for me is, I started out in this field as a clinician on psychedelic therapy research trials, right? So that's how I learned. That's where I was trained, but training wasn't really open outside of that. There weren't a lot of opportunities to get education outside of that. So we like to have this conversation between these two kinds of programs. Our guest today, Matthew Baggott, is a CEO of a company called Tactogen, and a lead research scientist there. He comes from a research scientist background, especially with MDMA and other Entactogens, and has been really working around some of the basic science behind how these drugs work and how they can potentially be optimized to help for their therapeutic potential. And so we have a lot of overlap in kind of our activities and conversations. We met years ago really through working in the field, and I'm also currently an advisor to Tactogen, which is a great way to have conversations and continue to contribute to research organizations and research projects that are maybe not quite at the stage of having clinical trials of the size that we would do therapist training for, but that are coming along the pipeline at a different stage. So I'm going to pause there because you'll hear plenty from me later. But Matt, I'd like to ask you to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your background and how you got into this and how you wound up being the CEO and lead research scientist of a drug developer in the psychedelic space.
Sure, yeah. Thanks for having me as well.
Mhm.
So I first got interested in psychedelics as an undergraduate in the 1980s. I was getting into the Grateful Dead at the same time. I was a philosophy undergraduate, and I thought that psychedelics were the most interesting thing I had encountered, and also that they had a lot of potential to help people. And it was kind of mysterious to me initially why science wasn't pursuing them enthusiastically. So I started to dig into the background and the history of them. And ultimately, I was able to like leverage that interest into getting a job in what was turned out to be, I didn't know it at the time, the first lab to study the potential neurotoxicity of MDMA. So I got very deep into both the promise of psychedelics and the older clinical research, but also the newer work on the concerns that they might be harmful to people's brains. And I've tried to kind of keep those two things in balance throughout my career. After I finished my undergraduate work, I worked full time in that lab, and then I moved to San Francisco and got a job in a research center where the chemist Sasha Shulgin was one of the collaborators. And so I got to know Sasha and his work more deeply. And this is around the time that he and his colleague Peyton were inventing the drug BK-MDMA or methadone. And Sasha, after he first encountered MDMA in the late 70s, became very interested in trying to develop new molecules. And both he and some other research groups, such as Dave Nichols at Purdue, really worked a lot on trying to find novel chemicals that would have that same core therapeutic action as MDMA, but might have slightly different effects, might be gentler on the body. They didn't have a whole lot of luck with that. Partly because the sort of the chemistry techniques that you had back in the 90s were sort of slow. And so, Sasha very much relied on making a molecule, tasting it himself, and seeing if he felt that it was active in an interesting way. And that kind of thing is very kind of, not scalable. You're gonna learn a lot of interesting things, but in a slow, deliberate manner. Um, and so always in the back of my head, I've been like, we should find new molecules that are better than MDMA. One of the things that's been of big interest to me also is how can we take MDMA itself and find ways of supporting that experience or making it gentler and safer. And so I did a little bit work with Dance Safe when they first were founded in San Francisco area and have been very interested in harm reduction as well.
Mhm.
So, fast forward to like around 2010, and, I'm kind of doing my practice of staying active on social media and places like Reddit. And I find that somebody is reporting that they've been able to make a cocktail that they think perfectly duplicates MDMA. And I'm like, oh, this is really scientifically interesting. If that's true, then it could help us to understand what it is that's special about MDMA. Because if this cocktail really needs multiple ingredients to get there, each of them must be contributing something. And so the basic idea that this person had was taking one molecule and then adding a little bit of a stimulant and a little bit of a tryptamine psychedelic. And I thought to myself, that's even more interesting because in some ways for therapy, what you might want is a molecule that is less psychedelic and less of a stimulant, but still has this kind of therapeutic, heart-opening, self-compassion sort of effect of an MDMA. And
Mhm.
the one of the molecules he was working on in these kinds of recipes was a benzofuran. So it's kind of a chemical structure where you take away one of MDMA's oxygens and you put a carbon in there. And that makes it a little harder for the body to break down. So those molecules tend to last a little longer, and people often don't need to redose with them. And so the seeds of Tactogen, the company that I'm currently CEO of, were really taking that benzofuran type molecule and trying to do some of the things that Dave Nichols and Sasha Shulgin had tried and then go beyond them, but using modern techniques where we can work faster because we're not having to taste each molecule. We can actually screen them in contemporary scientific methods. And so that's kind of a little bit about my background and what we're working on Tactogen. And at this point, we have a number of molecules we're happy with, and we're working on doing the safety studies so that we can move into actual clinical trials in humans.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very interesting legacy to think about because most people know of MDMA and know, that are in the field are familiar at least with the research that's been done on that. And there can be kind of a hyper focus on it or a laser focus on it. But the truth is there could be many potential variations, some of which may have therapeutic benefits beyond even that. And so I think it's a really, really interesting and important approach. And I'm wondering if you can kind of talk a little bit about like the history of MDMA research for folks that are not familiar. I mean, I can just give the briefest the briefest current events tagline right now. We're kind of in a phase of waiting after Lykos, a drug developer, submitted phase 3 research to the FDA and was asked for additional studies to be done. That was back in August. And so, but at the same time, partly I think because there's this history and MDMA has been around for a long time and there was sort of early interest in getting clinical research going with it, it was actually considered the first of so many drugs that are in development to reach that point with the FDA. So you want to just maybe talk a little bit about what that trajectory looks like and why MDMA was there first and what might have been maybe the pros and cons of that?
Sure, yeah. Since we're focusing on MDMA, I should just mention that years ago, I did some contracting work and helped what was then MAPS get their clinical studies in patients started. I drafted the first version of what's called an investigator's brochure that summarizes the research for the study investigators. So I have some background of working with them, but that was years ago. So MDMA is one of these first, Entactogens and one of the first, what you might call psychedelics to get this far in clinical trials, getting to the point where they're asking FDA for permission to market it. And the reason for that is really that there has been so much research done by labs around the world that MDMA was relatively well understood. And so I think at one point I counted up how much money the National Institute on Drug Abuse had spent on MDMA, and it was something like $460 million. And aside from that, Lykos Therapeutics, the company that's sponsoring MDMA and trying to get it approved as a medicine, has done a certain amount of studies with it, but there's been over 1,500 participants given MDMA in other studies that weren't sponsored by Lykos. And so there's a whole lot of work that's been done on it, which makes it relatively well understood. And so because of that, FDA has let them move a little bit faster, I think, than you would have to move if you had just invented a brand new compound. Usually, though, when FDA lets you move a little faster like that, it's not that they let you skip steps, but that they let you do them out of order. So, where MDMA is now is that the FDA declined to approve it and issued what's called a complete response letter requesting more data. And now Lykos Therapeutics is presumably deciding on their next steps. There's a number of layers of uncertainty to what's going to happen next because we have a new administration, which might have new policies about drug approvals. We also have some potential changes at Lykos, where there's been an offer to fund Lykos by a new group that is being backed by Rick Doblin. And if that proposal goes through, it's possible that there will be new leadership at Lykos that might take a different kind of approach to FDA. And then also, we don't know exactly the full extent of what was in the FDA's letter to Lykos. And so we do know that that they were asked to provide more data, as in another separate phase 3 trial. So like a large scale trial to try and show efficacy, show how well it works. From the conversations that were public, one of the areas that seems to be kind of a question is the durability of the benefits of MDMA. Because
Mhm.
if you get like, 3 experiences with preparation and integration, and then you're essentially cured, then you don't really have to worry about whether there's subtle toxicities in the MDMA. But if it's the kind of thing where you would need it a couple times a year to kind of stay on the right track, then FDA is going to become more concerned about, well, maybe there's going to be, something that you don't detect in these sort of couple hundred people that have gone through the Lykos trials, and maybe you need to start getting a bigger safety data set. But
Mhm.
we don't really know exactly what the concerns were with the data supplied that led to the request for a new phase 3 trial.
Right. And just to mention also for the audience's context, some of you wouldn't necessarily know this. I also worked on those phase 2 and 3 trials, a series of Lykos sponsored trials that were submitted that was going on for a long time. It was a lot of participants, a lot of study visits. I was one of the site co-principal investigators in New York City. I actually worked on those studies at 2 different sites. And it's a very, very comprehensive, big project. I think it can be hard for folks that were not involved to understand quite how many steps and how much detail is in that data. You see it distilled down into a paper, but the actual like full reports that are really just probably mostly just between the FDA and Lykos, a lot of those details aren't publicly available. It's just a phenomenal amount of information.
Absolutely. And so it may be worth slowing down and saying that, the way what we call a phase 3 trial works is that Lykos, or the sponsor, doesn't collect the data themselves. They
Right.
would have contracts with a number of different trial sites, which would be collecting data. And the way the study was designed, those trial sites are providing the treatment and collecting some of the data, but for the important outcome measures, the primary and secondary outcome measures, the sort of the big ones that indicate, did people get better or not? Did the treatment work? Those were actually being collected by independent observers who weren't at those sites and who were randomly assigned to the participant each time it was at a time point where you wanted to collect one of those outcome measures. And so because of that design, my take is that it's very likely that the data are overall reliable. If there were a problem at a single site, it would be easily detectable by Lykos or by the FDA. And so that kind of thing would be unlikely to change the overall results of the study. And also, if there were some kind of more comprehensive pressure, like across all the sites, uh, I would expect that to be reflected in both the primary and the secondary outcome measures. But if you look at both those, it looks to me like the secondary outcome measures are suggesting that the treatment is useful, but is not a miracle cure, and that many of the participants will continue to have meaningful struggles on a day-to-day basis. And so to
Right.
me, the data look really quite plausible and realistic. And I expect that whatever kinds of auditing is taking place or does take place in the future, that the main results are probably going to stand up and continue to be unchanged.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting the way, because we work with a lot of different trial sponsors now that are doing phase 2 and 3 studies post Lykos. Fluence did not work with Lykos on this study, but many of us who work at Fluence did work on the trial at the trial site that was contracted by the sponsor to collect the data, as you were just saying. So we have a relationships there. But now when we are working on other studies that are going forth and we see, kind of how they're structured, there's a lot of complexity and there's a lot of checks and balances and a lot of protection against the sort of assessments the actual outcome measures being skewed by anyone's guess or knowledge, or even knowledge of where the participant is at in terms of the process. So I think it was separated out well in that study, and it probably will continue to be even more well separated out as far as how that data is collected. I'm wondering if, we mentioned for a minute something about policy and how there are potential shifts in regulatory policy, or potential shifts in what is required to get marketing approval for a drug could impact this situation. So there's one scenario in which the regulations stay the same, and the applications are submitted or resubmitted, and then they meet the bar for approval. There's another scenario, I think it's on a lot of people's minds these days, of, well, what if the regulations are changed, or the FDA starts looking differently at things? We talked a little bit about this the other day. Would you be willing to share a little bit of your thoughts about what might be cooking there, or what might actually happen, and like what kind of the pros and cons of that kind of change would be?
Sure, yeah. So a number of the people that have either been nominated for a position in the administration or are in the new administration have advocated for a change where the FDA becomes more concerned about safety and less about efficacy. That is, less about whether the treatments actually are helpful. And it's kind of a libertarian view that some of those aspects should just be worked out by the marketplace. Although many people who are more familiar with the current system have questions as to how you can really understand safety aside from efficacy, because ultimately the safe, everything is unsafe at some point. And so the question is it helpful before it becomes harmful? And so isolating just the idea of safety doesn't make a lot of sense for a lot of things. And also it's hard to understand how the marketplace could really function in, areas like oncology. Like if you come down with a cancer, how could you really do the research to decide which treatment you think is best? That would presumably be offloaded on somebody else. And, how could they understand that, especially with a new medicine? So it gets very complicated, and it does seem to me that there would be some value in continuing to have the FDA function as it is. One of the values of that would be that when new treatments are approved, you really want payers like insurance companies to reimburse for them. And if it's unclear how well they work, you might have a problem where payers will be reluctant to cover those new treatments, and then they become only available to people that can afford to pay out of pocket for them. And I think that's undesirable. So there is this question as to whether FDA might have a change in philosophy and become less concerned with whether treatments work and more concerned with whether they're safe. In that case, things like MDMA that are pretty well understood in terms of safety might be able to get approved more quickly.
Mhm.
I think that that's currently a question as to how much change there'll be there. One of the things that I think is true is that the FDA's decision making over drug approval, I think, is delegated to them from HHS, Health and Human Services, the agency in which they sit. And so potentially that decision making power could be taken from FDA, or FDA could be overruled on a case-by-case basis. And so there, it's very unclear as to what's going to happen moving forward. So we have this kind of new philosophy with the new administration. We also have seemingly an enthusiasm, or at least openness, for psychedelics, also from some of these same individuals. And so,
Yeah.
there might be big changes happening.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the openness to, certainly to these applications and to the conversations about them, seems to have been there on some level all along. And I remember when I first really got seriously involved in the field, I had a 2-year postdoc where I did a deep dive on reading. Read everything I could find about psychedelic therapy, history, research, literature, including some of your early work. And I, I remember learning a lot about that process, and really being struck by how when research and psychedelics began to be prohibited in the late 60s and set in around 1970 fully, there seemed to actually be continued support within a lot of these governmental agencies for research, for good clinical research, and that did eventually, approvals were, people did begin to be able to get approvals again for human research with psychedelics, starting in the late 90s. So there's always been, I think, a trajectory of some support for it. And, you have to understand, these aren't just monolithic buildings made of rocks. They're people that work there who have experiences and family members. And I think there's a human element to it too, where you can almost always find somebody who's got an interest and some openness to it. But I haven't gotten the sense that that has been like the barrier, but rather there's just, this hasn't been done for a really long time, and the standards have changed, standards have evolved as far as what kind of research and what kind of efficacy data is expected, and it's hard to fit psychedelics into those models, right? We're not talking about antibiotics where you have a very clear, very specific, you take the drug, it does a thing, you stop taking it, it stops doing the thing, which is the model for under which I think a lot of these paradigms were developed, right? A lot of the sort of expectations of how a study should run were developed with that type of molecule. So I digress a little bit, but I do think there's willingness there. There's a lot of people now that have had exposure to a lot of these different protocols and studies at those agencies now, and they're kind of learning more as time goes on.
Absolutely, yeah. I wouldn't want our participants to go away with the idea that FDA has been less than supportive of good psychedelic research. They've always been really, really good, I think, and much better than DEA has been. I think that there is a case to be made that FDA has changed their stance about whether placebo effects and unblinding and expectancy is a major issue. I think that if you go back, say, like 10 years or more, they were not concerned about that. And I think that they have become concerned in recent years. And that's a bit of a change that for these kind of long, slow projects, like getting MDMA approved, kind of ends up being difficult, because if you've designed a protocol many years ago with a certain expectation that FDA will look at it one way, and then FDA personnel changes over time and FDA evolves some of their views, then the study might end up getting a different hearing at the end. And there's a case to be made that might have happened with the Lykos new drug application. But yes, FDA has been solidly good partners for scientists who want to do psychedelic research for as long as I've been in the field.
Yeah. I just want to post a reminder to anybody who would like to put questions in the Q&A. If you're watching and you've got questions, please don't forget that's there to you. We'll get to that in just a little bit. But yeah, it is a really fascinating process, and the FDA works with all kinds of different drugs and molecules and policies. It's important. I mean, I think it's an important aspect of our lives. And what people are really going for is another thing that you might not be familiar with is what these drug developers and Tactogen eventually will be on this track as well, I hope, is marketing approval, right? So my understanding, and I'm obviously not a marketing approval attorney, but is that this is the approval to be able to make claims about your drug product's efficacy for a certain diagnosis, right? And that's a protected thing to be able to say, which is why if you are if you're a doctor, if you're a licensed mental health care provider, you have to be very careful about whether or not if you are providing a treatment, if it is an approved treatment, or if you're providing a treatment off label for something, if you're a prescriber, being clear that, you are providing something that is approved for a certain indication, or that it is an off label treatment for a certain indication. And that partly for third party payer coverage, but also because that's, the practice of medicine, the practice of healthcare is providing things that have an evidence base and then have approvals for them. And so there's licensure issues as well, right? There's issues for professionals to be able to know that they can, within their scope of practice, recommend something because it has an FDA approval and it has been approved for a certain indication. And this is something that we deal with, in training now for therapists who are receiving questions from clients who might be coming in and saying, well, therapist, can I get some ketamine for my depression? Right? You might be able to say, well, first of all, as a therapist, I'm not a prescriber, so you're going to have to go to a prescriber for a medical evaluation. It can be prescribed off-label for certain mental health indications. There is also an FDA-approved ketamine product that can be prescribed specifically for mental health indication under certain conditions. And that's what allows us to have those conversations in a measured way that's aligned with licensure and aligned with what third-party payers will theoretically cover, or are moving towards covering, as well as what malpractice insurance will cover as far as a professional's activity. So there's a lot wrapped up into this. Yeah.
Absolutely.
A lot wrapped up in these approvals.
And
I wonder, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it might be interesting to talk briefly about some of the other entactogens that are being developed by different companies. None of them are as far along as Lykos is with racemic MDMA, but there's work on what's called methylone, or the beta keto analog of MDMA, and there's also work on using just one of the two mirror images, one of the two enantiomers of MDMA, and those may have interesting profiles that are different from the MDMA that Lykos is making. And of course, Tactogen, we ourselves are working, and we aren't at clinical stage yet, but hope to be by the middle of next year, making new molecules. And a lot of these ones that are being developed were synthesized in the 90s or earlier, sometimes by Dave Nichols or Sasha Shulgin, and have a lot of interesting things in common or different from MDMA. And a lot of the work back then was done under this kind of great concern about neurotoxicity and the potential for these molecules to cause long-term lowerings in serotonin at higher doses or with repeated closely spaced doses. And one of the interesting things about the R enantiomer of MDMA is that it doesn't cause these sorts of lowerings of serotonin. And similarly, the beta keto analog methylone is also in this category where it doesn't really seem to lower your serotonin. That whether or not a clinical dose of MDMA lowers serotonin is not well established. My guess is it probably doesn't do it much unless you get to the kind of higher end of doses and with redoses. But we have done some work at Tactogen based on earlier studies showing that if you give rats really high doses of MDMA and cause serotonin depletion, you can prevent a lot of that by giving an SSRI after the MDMA. You can do it by giving it before the MDMA, which is not super surprising because you're just blocking the MDMA's effects. But if you give the SSRI after the MDMA, you can essentially shorten some of the MDMA effects and protect against this kind of serotonin depletion. And so I ran a study in healthy volunteers where we gave a standard dose of MDMA, and then a few hours later, we gave an SSRI citalopram. What we found was that the next day, people, if they just had the MDMA alone, they were kind of, feeling a little fuzzy. And if we gave them a challenging cognitive task, they didn't perform quite as well as normal. But if we had given them the MDMA and then an SSRI dose, they were able to perform at normal levels. And
Mhm.
anecdotally, some people out in the world of illicit MDMA use feel like when they take MDMA, they have a worsened mood midweek, like say around 72 hours later. And anecdotally, if people take an SSRI at the tail of MDMA, then it may protect against this lowered mood. And so one of the things that we've been interested in studying further is whether this could be used clinically to kind of make the MDMA experience something that is a little gentler on people.
Yeah, yeah, that's really, really interesting. I wonder, yeah, I mean, it really with the interesting trajectory of like following what's happening out in the community, right? You mentioned organizations like Dance Safe, very up to date on what people are doing in terms of just what's happening out in the world. Um, Collecting, analyzing, understanding those trends, and then bringing them into the lab and trying to, quantify them, understand them, and then see if there's something there that can be derived as a real benefit. It's almost like a crowdsourced research project there. So yeah, I think that's a really, really, really interesting idea. There's also differences. I mean, just in many researchers have talked about this, but in terms of like dosing in MDMA and research studies, we're often talking about obviously a limited and very specific amount, but we're also talking about taking it at 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning during daytime, and so you're not getting concurrent disruptions in sleep, which I think are potentially it could exacerbate any kind of other difficulties one might have afterward, right? Because it's almost like you're mixing jet lag with whatever else is happening. I don't know about anybody else, but jet lag really gets me. So that's a big piece of it. Yeah. Um, I wonder if you have a comment on this question, which is this is coming from me, but what what do you think some of the biggest like misconceptions or maybe like potential misunderstandings about the future of MDMA therapy are right now, like in terms of rollout, what people are imagining? What are some of the questions you get about that? I have a few that are on my mind, but I'm wondering if we could talk about like if and when there is an approval, what do you think this is going to look like for folks? What do
Sure,
people
yeah.
know now to be prepared?
So what we expect is that it'll be approved with what we call a REMS, uh, a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, which is going to be a plan that Lycos and FDA agree upon to essentially monitor people who are treated and ensure that there's nothing untoward happens to them, and also ensure that the teams providing the treatment, both like pharmacists as well as the actual care teams, the prescribing physician, all are adequately trained and know how to work with this substance. So that is probably going to significantly slow down the number of people who can access MDMA in the early years.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know exactly what the REMS will be. We saw like what Lycos was proposing in the advisory committee meeting that FDA held. But that may change if new leadership come in and have a different philosophy of how to approach things. But I think the biggest thing is going to be that like just because MDMA is approved as a medicine, it doesn't mean that you're going to be able to go to your psychiatrist if you have one, or therapist if you have one, and say, hey, I want to be treated with MDMA because I think I have PTSD, or I think it would help me, or whatever. Like there's going to be very few people doing it for a while, and it's going to kind of slowly build, and hopefully that'll help to maintain safety on it. And
Mm-hmm.
so that one of the things that is also maybe a misconception, but maybe is less of a misconception with this group of people, is that Lycos themselves aren't necessarily really going to be that involved in the treatment. It's going to be people are going to, if they want to be a prescriber, are going to or they're going to need to go through some kind of treatment. Sorry, not a treatment. They're going to need to go through some kind of training. But once they've had this training, it's not going to necessarily limit them to using the same kind of therapy Lycos used or anything like that. Physicians will be free to take care of patients as best they can according to their understanding of that. There may be some constraints from payers. So I imagine that insurers will say, hey, we only know this works in these ways. So if you want to get reimbursed, then you should also do the therapy in the way that we know works. But yeah, so I think that to me, those are kind of the two things. Is one is that rollout will be slow and probably limited. And two is that the care teams are going to have freedom to take care of patients in the way that they think is best. And so the kind of Lycos style therapy that has been criticized as being, maybe too derived from Stan Grof and other things, like isn't necessarily going to be used.
Mhm.
And do you have any other thoughts on big myths
Yeah.
that are
Yeah,
out
I
there?
mean, it is definitely not going to be just like flip a switch and all of a sudden you can go roll down to the pharmacy and pick up a pack of MDMA pills. There's a lot of infrastructure, I think, that's going to need to go into this. I do think prescriber training and education is going to be really, really important, as well as therapist training and education. And patient education, right? Patient education is a whole nother department of materials, because there's a lot to educate patients about in terms of what the process looks like, even of psychedelic therapy in general, right? And I'm just thinking back to many of the studies that we've worked on. Not only do we have lengthy informed consent documents, but there's often a long conversation about what to expect during the treatment, what the experience might be like. People have a lot of questions. You want to be able to answer those from a knowledgeable place, and that's not something that you can just I think I don't think it's something you can just hand somebody a pamphlet about and say, here, make up your mind. Do you want to take a simple antibiotic or Tylenol or something or not? Because there's this experiential component, this subjective experience, which is quite intense for many folks. There's some real careful decision making that needs to go into that. So I look forward to that. I think that's a place where clinicians' skills really come in handy. I think clinicians with proper training and education can really help facilitate those discussions. But we certainly don't want a scenario where people feel as though, they haven't been properly educated about it ahead of time, and therefore they didn't have a true informed consent to it. And I do think that process is going to look, or should look, different from the way that it looks for many medical treatments, where your doctor says, you got such and such, I'm going to give you these pills, come back and see me in 30 days. They might have 2 or 3 side effects. You'll be fine. Call me if you don't feel well. Like they don't, we've all probably had doctors prescribe things for us. They don't go into a long discussion about informed consent and side effects and stuff. And hopefully you can ask your doctor questions. But it's not usually a huge discussion. And I do think that psychedelic therapies warrant a different approach in terms of that consent conversation. Otherwise, we're going to have a lot of people who are really surprised. Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's where my thinking is really around the training and education aspect of it. Another thing is, this is, now in the last 4 or 5 years, I think people have more access to resources. There's more discussion about psychedelics, maybe in, psychology programs and graduate schools, but still training about psychedelic research, history, therapies is not a standard part of medical school curriculum or nurse practitioner training or prescriber training. There was a gap in the research, and there was a long period during which these therapies were not even really being researched to a degree that people would have paid a lot of attention and done education about them. So we now have a workforce that has limited knowledge about it, or if they have had this knowledge about it, they've sought it out elsewhere by reading research articles or coming to CE programs or things like that. And so over time, hopefully it gets more integrated into those core education programs. But the bulk of the current, prescribers and therapists outside of this group, probably you guys are all very familiar. But if you look at the workforce in general, you don't have those basics, and you don't have that training education. So there's a upskilling that's going to need to happen across the board. Another one of my sort of always standing theories is that everyone in healthcare should have some basic knowledge of how these therapies work, because even if you're not providing them, your patients may have taken them with someone else. They may have had psychedelic therapy before, they may be seeking it. So even if you're a general practice nurse, or you're a physician's assistant at a family practice, you may have patients who've interacted with this or who will interact with it. It's important to know about it. It's important to know what it is, how to talk to people about it, how to understand it, how to be respectful about it. Because the risk is that if that doesn't happen, there can be more stigma attached to these treatments, and that will actually discourage people from accessing them. So access isn't just about availability legally and having payers and having pharmacists that can dispense and prescribers that can prescribe. It also has to be acceptable within the community. And that's something that all healthcare providers can be educated such that they can make it less of a stigmatized idea in the first place. Yeah.
So I see there's a question in the chat from Lawrence.
Yeah.
Maybe we can jump in and answer that. Or
why don't we jump into that one? Lawrence is, for those who aren't aware, one of the trainers at Fluence, teaching in our psychoanalytic programming with Jeffrey Gus. And so he says, Matthew, you mentioned FDA's move towards increasing concern with placebo effects and blinding. Can you comment on how these concerns may affect both Lykos next phase 3 trial, as also the future of psychedelic assisted therapy trials?
Sure, yeah. And so the easiest way to try and address this is by using lower doses and higher doses and looking for a dose effect. And so the idea would be that if you think that there really is some kind of pharmacological therapeutic effect, then up to a certain point, getting a higher dose should make that therapeutic effect more powerful. And so you could give like a really low dose that you don't think is particularly helpful as one of the conditions in your phase 3 trial. And then say, so then participants who get that will say, oh, I got some MDMA, I could really feel it, but it may not be that helpful. And then you have another dose you can compare it to that's the full dose that you think is going to be very helpful. And in both cases, the person knows they didn't get placebo, and they may still, in both cases, have an expectancy that it'll be helpful. And so looking for dose effects is the standard way to get around this. None of this is perfect, of course, and there is a reason why Lykos didn't use low dose comparisons in their trials. They felt like they had tried it and it didn't work because in their judgment, it made some of the participants worse. That's an interesting finding. A number of researchers, including myself, have done experiments where we've given healthy volunteers similar low doses of MDMA, and we didn't see any evidence that it somehow, was dysphoric or anxiogenic. And that might be more about the specifics of a trial where you're trying to help someone with a limited number of sessions. And so if you were someone who has a lot of hope that MDMA is going to help you, you're going to get 3 experiences with it or up to 3 experiences with it, then you might put a lot of kind of put all of your hopes into these experiences. And so if you start to feel one, but it doesn't seem like it's being useful, that might really cause you to feel bad in a number of ways. Like you might blame yourself for not benefiting from it. You might just feel despair because you had hoped that this would cure you. And so I think some of that kind of stuff that's maybe specific to a trial might have happened and made the low doses less well, tolerated or acceptable in the Lykos trials. But, in general, like you could give somebody 30 or 40 milligrams of MDMA and, it just has less intense effects overall, I think.
Mhm. I my hunch is, and as a drug researcher, you may have a hunch as well about this as well, but my hunch is that that could be true insofar as we're relying on the biochemical effects of the drug of the psychedelic for change, but that the experiential psychological components of that, and obviously these are not two distinguishable things, um, could be somewhat independent of that. So somebody could have, for instance, a low dose experience and maybe have something that was psychologically profoundly helpful about that, due to their relationship with their therapists, the act of surrendering, the sense of a different state of mind for a few hours, all of these other factors, and maybe a higher dose works for a different set of reasons. So it's possible, but I would be curious to see how much that's relying on just a psychopharmacological drug effect approach, which I know is really, I think, what the FDA is looking for, but not sure if it's going to work here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that Lycos would disagree with my assessment, with what I just said. And I think there's a lot of complexity here, and we don't really know the full answer. Um, my anticipation, though, is that if you are outside of a clinical trial setting and you have a lower dose, you both have less intense therapeutic effects, also less intense side effects. Um,
Yeah.
and that is plausibly going to be helpful for a lot of people. Getting the right dose of MDMA, I think, is an important thing, and we're not very good at it yet. And so one of the reasons I think we can improve on MDMA and make better next generation molecules is that as you give higher doses of MDMA, you do get sort of greater intensity of the kind of self-compassion and decreased avoidance and decreased neuroticism, but you also start to get kind of impairments where people are, feel like kind of stoned or drunken. And what users report in non-medical settings is that they sometimes just like lose their memory of the experience, and the next day they don't quite remember what happened. And I think that those aren't intrinsic to entactogens, and you can make entactogens that are minimally impairing and where there's less discontinuity between your ordinary self and this experience, and it becomes easier to integrate, and you don't have risk of memory loss and things like that, which
Mhm.
I think, is one of the issues with MDMA.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. It'll be interesting to see what if there is an approval, what the prescribing guidance, is, and to what extent. I don't know if there will be limits on how much can be prescribed over time or any kind of a patient registry or anything like that. But it will be really interesting to see what happens there and how much is prescribed and for what indications. I know early on there was some thinking that different indications, with psilocybin work, different indications might need different dosages. And so far, most of the research that we have with MDMA is either it's healthy volunteers or it's people with PTSD. So it'll be interesting to see again if it's used for other indications, if people find that different dosages are needed. It's just a whole host of things to be explored there. I hope there's really good follow-up, phase 4 data and exploration of actual prescribing trends and actual use trends, if there is an approval afterward.
Yes. I think expectation is that there will be a patient registry and every patient will be entered into that. And so there will be the possibility of doing those sorts of analyses and figuring out what the trends are in this larger group. And hopefully
Really,
that
really
does happen.
we're getting close to the end of the time. I wanted to just ask you if, Matt, if there's anything you would like to cover, anything else you'd like to share, any announcements or anything coming up that you'd like to socialize with the folks that are here and potentially watching later. Any questions you would have liked to have been asked that I forgot?
Um, Not really, no. I would just say that I I continue to think that MDMA and entactogens are an extraordinarily hopeful treatment that have potential to help a large number of people who are struggling. And so I'm optimistic that they will begin to be approved and available as medicines. And but we need to do it in a considered manner that uh, where we try to do our best to protect patients and learn from the experience. It's unfortunate that Australia, which has rolled out, MDMA for PTSD, is not requiring that all patients be entered into some kind of registry so that they can get an overview of what the experience is. I think that it's an option, but it's not really a funded thing. Um, and and so overall, I think that this is going to be something that helps a lot of people, and it's one of the bright spots in medicine right now in a world where we need bright spots as much as possible.
Absolutely. I first got involved in MDMA research. I was asked to join the then MAPS, now Lycos, training program. And my background was in addiction psychology, which is why I was working on psilocybin research. And my attraction to it was because I could see that it was more of a way to potentially get towards some of the root causes that were driving a lot of the problems that I was hoping to help address or help find better solutions for with my time in this life. So I remain very hopeful about it, and from what I've seen, just witnessing things in trials, talking to patients over the years, there's really some immense potential for growth and change here. So we really thank you for coming on and talking about this topic and sharing your insights and expertise with our audience. I'm excited for the future of mental health care research, especially around psychedelics, especially around Entactogens, and what Tactogen is up to. If anybody's not following yet, please look them up, tactogen.com. Matt's social media link is in the chat for you. We will send out a recording to everybody who's here and or signed up, with also including those links. And please stay attentive to our newsletters and mailing lists, because as soon as we are able to bring you more education and training and professional development in this area, we absolutely will be there to do it. So that's all I got for today. Thank you so much, Matt, for joining us. Thank you, everybody in the audience, for your questions and for hanging on and staying curious. And we hope to see you next time.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Elizabeth.